Keanu Reeves adjusted the baseball cap low over his face as he stepped out of the modest diner on a quiet corner of Los Angeles. The early evening air was crisp, the streets buzzing with their usual hum of city life. He liked walking anonymously in the city, a rare luxury for someone of his fame. As he turned the corner, he noticed a commotion up ahead. A delivery van had stopped abruptly in the middle of the road, its driver yelling at someone on the sidewalk. The man being berated was older, with a scruffy beard and worn clothes. He clutched a shopping cart filled with what looked like all his possessions, his face a mix of fear and confusion. "Get out of the way, you idiot!" the driver shouted, his face red with anger. "You think I've got all day? Move it!" The older man tried to speak, his voice trembling. I didn't mean to. The cart's wheel got stuck." The driver leaned further out of his window, his rage unrelenting. "I don't care. Get your junk off the street before I run it over." Keanu froze for a moment, his instincts telling him to mind his own business. But as the scene unfolded, he couldn't just walk away. His hands clenched into fists and he stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Hey, that's enough." The driver turned sharply, his anger now directed at Keanu. "Who the hell are you? This guy's blocking the road and I'm late for my deliveries." Keanu didn't flinch. "You're late because you're sitting here yelling at someone who clearly needs help. Why don't you try being a decent human being for 5 minutes?" The driver's eyes narrowed. "Oh, and you're some kind of saint? Mind your own business." Keanu stepped closer, his tone still calm but unyielding. "It is my business when someone's being treated like this. Now step out of your van and help him, or I will." The driver hesitated, clearly taken aback by Keanu's composure and intensity. But before he could respond, another voice piped up from the sidewalk. "Wait a second. Is that—" A young woman standing nearby pulled out her phone, her eyes widening. "That's Keanu Reeves." The driver's face paled as murmurs rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Keanu sighed inwardly, his cover blown, but he kept his focus on the older man, kneeling to inspect the shopping cart's stuck wheel. "It's just jammed," he said gently. "Let me help." As he worked to free the wheel, the driver fumbled for words, his earlier bravado crumbling. I didn't realize, I didn't know it was you." Keanu glanced up, his expression serious. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect." The crowd watched in silence as Keanu freed the cart and stood, helping the older man steady it. "You okay, sir?" The man nodded, his eyes misty. "Thank you. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Keanu smiled softly. "You're not the one causing trouble." As the crowd began to disperse, the driver slumped back into his seat, his face flushed with shame. Keanu turned to him one last time. "Be better." Without waiting for a reply, he tipped his cap, adjusted his jacket and walked away, leaving behind a stunned audience and a man with a lot to think about. As Keanu walked away, the murmurs of the crowd behind him began to fade, but the encounter lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of the older man's trembling hands, clutching that cart like it was the only thing tethering him to the world. Keanu had always been good at reading people, and the look in that man's eyes wasn't just fear, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a lifetime of invisible burdens. A few blocks down, Keanu ducked into a quieter street. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Hey, Jimmy, it's me," he said when the call connected. On the other end, Jimmy, his longtime friend and assistant, replied with a laugh. "Let me guess, you're wandering around again and need me to pick you up." "Not yet," Keanu said, his tone serious. "I need you to look into something for me. There's a homeless guy near the corner of Melrose and Vine, pushing a cart. Looks like he's been through a lot. Can you figure out who he is, maybe see if he needs help?" Jimmy paused, sensing the gravity in Keanu's voice. "You got it. I'll check it out." "Thanks," Keanu said, ending the call. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his steps slowing as he thought about what more he could do. Meanwhile, back on Melrose, the older man had finally moved his cart out of the street. He sat on a nearby bench, his hands still shaking. The encounter with the angry driver had rattled him, but what lingered most in his mind was the man who had stepped in to defend him. He didn't recognize Keanu Reeves, but he recognized kindness, a rare thing in his world. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the street, the man leaned back on the bench, clutching a small, worn photograph he'd taken from his cart. It was of a young boy, his son, smiling brightly in a school uniform. The man's eyes filled with tears as he traced the edges of the picture. "Someday," he whispered, "someday I'll make it right." At that moment, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, and a sharply dressed man leaned out. It was Jimmy. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Are you all right, sir?" The older man blinked, startled. Who are you?" "A friend," Jimmy replied, stepping out of the car. "I think someone you met earlier sent me to check on you. Do you need anything? Food? Place to stay?" The man hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation. Finally, he shook his head. "I'm fine, just trying to get by." Jimmy frowned but didn't press further. "All right, but here." He handed the man a card. "If you need anything, call this number, no strings attached." The man took the card, his hand still unsteady. "Why are you doing this?" Jimmy smiled. "Because someone believes you deserve it." As the car pulled away, the man sat in stunned silence, the card clutched in his hand. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. The older man, whose name was revealed on the card as Samuel Dawson, sat quietly on the bench, turning the card over and over in his hand. It bore nothing but a phone number and the words, "Always reach out." He tucked it into his pocket, unsure whether he'd ever call it. That night, Samuel found himself staring at the photo of his son again, his mind racing with memories of better times. He'd once been an electrician, proud and hard-working, but life had taken its toll, a workplace accident, mounting medical bills, and the eventual loss of his home. His son, Daniel, had gone to live with his ex-wife, and communication between them had become sparse. Samuel clung to the hope that one day he could stand on his own feet again and rebuild those bridges. Meanwhile, Jimmy returned to Keanu's home, where he found the actor sitting by a fireplace, lost in thought. Jimmy handed Keanu a folder. "I did some digging. His name's Samuel Dawson. He used to be an electrician. Looks like life hit him pretty hard after an accident. No criminal record, no trouble, just bad luck." Keanu flipped through the file, his expression growing more determined. "And his family?" Jimmy hesitated. "He has a son, lives with his ex-wife in Bakersfield. No contact for years as far as I can tell." Keanu leaned back, rubbing his temples. "We can't just hand him money. That doesn't solve anything. What do you think?" Jimmy smirked. "I think you've already decided what you're going to do." The next morning, Keanu set his plan into motion. With Jimmy's help, they arranged for Samuel to be invited to a job fair under the guise of a community outreach program. It was held at a local event center, and when Samuel arrived, he found himself overwhelmed by the energy of the room, tables lined with recruiters, job postings, and workshops. He felt out of place until a woman approached him with a kind smile. "Mr. Dawson?" she asked. Samuel nodded hesitantly. "I'm Lisa," she said, extending a hand. "I run a program that helps skilled tradespeople like yourself get back into the workforce. Let's talk about what you can do." Samuel's heart raced. He hadn't touched a toolbox in years, but as he sat down with Lisa, he felt a flicker of his old confidence returning. She asked him questions about his experience, his skills, and his goals. For the first time in years, someone was listening to him, not as a burden, but as a person with value. Unbeknownst to Samuel, Keanu was watching from a discreet corner of the room. He smiled as he saw the older man begin to engage, his posture straightening as he spoke. It wasn't just about giving Samuel a job, it was about giving him his dignity back. But just as things seemed to be turning around, an unexpected figure walked into the room. Samuel froze mid-sentence, his face draining of color. It was Graham, an old colleague from his electrical days, the man who had caused the accident that derailed Samuel's life. Graham hadn't noticed Samuel yet, but the sight of him brought back a flood of bitter memories. Samuel clenched his fists, his newfound hope teetering on the edge. Keanu noticed the change in Samuel's demeanor. He followed his line of sight and understood immediately. This wasn't just about a job. This was about closure. Samuel sat frozen, his mind racing with a mix of anger and fear. Graham looked the same as he had all those years ago, confident, self-assured, and completely unaware of the devastation he'd left behind. Memories of that fateful day came flooding back, the faulty wiring, the ignored safety warnings, and the explosion that had shattered Samuel's career and his life. Keanu observed the tension from across the room. Samuel's body language had shifted entirely, his shoulders hunched, his hands gripping the edges of his seat. Keanu's instincts kicked in, and he approached quietly, sitting beside him without a word. "You know him, don't you?" Keanu said softly. Samuel nodded, his voice low and strained. "He's the reason I ended up like this. He cut corners, ignored the rules, and when it all fell apart, he walked away without a scratch. No apology, no accountability, nothing." Keanu leaned forward, his voice calm but resolute. "And what do you want to do about it?" Samuel looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and uncertainty. "What can I do? He's probably forgotten I even exist." Keanu's gaze hardened. "Maybe, but this isn't about him remembering you. It's about you remembering who you are." As the words sank in, Graham finally noticed Samuel. His eyes widened for a split second before he plastered on a polite smile and approached. "Samuel, wow, it's been a long time." Samuel stood, his legs shaky but firm. "Graham." Graham extended a hand, but Samuel didn't take it. Instead, he met Graham's gaze with a quiet intensity. "Didn't think I'd see you here," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. Graham chuckled nervously. "Yeah, well, life takes you in all kinds of directions. What have you been up to?" Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Surviving." The room seemed to quiet around them as the tension grew. Graham shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Samuel, I'm sorry about what happened back then. But things were complicated. It wasn't entirely my fault." Samuel cut him off. "It wasn't complicated. It was negligence. And it cost me everything." Keanu, still seated nearby, watched the exchange carefully. He didn't intervene, but his presence was a steadying force for Samuel. For the first time, Graham's confident facade cracked. I didn't know things got that bad for you. If I had, I would have..." Samuel shook his head. "You would have what? Done something? Taken responsibility? You had your chance." Graham's shoulders slumped, and for a moment he seemed genuinely remorseful. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't change the past, but maybe I can make it right now. I work with a contracting firm. We've got projects lined up that need someone with your expertise. If you're willing, I can put in a word." The offer hung in the air, heavy with implications. Samuel stared at Graham, searching his face for sincerity. Before Samuel could respond, Keanu finally spoke. "This isn't about a handout, Graham. It's about trust. If you're serious about making things right, you'll give him a fair shot. No strings, no favors. Just let his work speak for itself." Graham nodded, his expression earnest. "Of course. I'll make sure of it." Samuel hesitated, his emotions warring within him. But then he thought of the photo in his pocket, the dream of reconnecting with his son. This wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about reclaiming his life. "All right," Samuel said finally, his voice firm. "But don't expect me to forget what happened." Graham nodded solemnly. "I wouldn't." As the two men parted ways, Keanu placed a reassuring hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You did good," he said with a small smile. Samuel exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift from his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was taking a step forward, toward a future he thought he'd lost forever.